Okay, so welcome to my pop-up. Tonight we will be discussing the Kyoto School and what these Japanese Buddhist philosophers have to contribute to this idea of ecological civilization, which is certainly very important for the issues that we're facing nowadays, and something that the Center for Process Studies and the Cobb Institute are both very focused on. So I'm drawing on some of my own background here to hopefully contribute to that conversation tonight. So the Kyoto School, these are some Japanese philosophers. Here are three important figures in this school. We have Nishida Kitaro, Nishitani Keiji, and Ueda Shizuteru. So these are sort of three generations of philosophers in this lineage, with Nishida being sort of the founding figure of the school, and Nishitani being his star pupil, with Ueda coming after. And unfortunately, Ueda sensei passed away rather recently, within the past couple of years, though there's still a lot of excellent work going on in the Kyoto School with these ideas. And certainly these three figures are not the only important philosophers within this movement. So who were the Kyoto School? So mostly we're talking about 20th century Japanese philosophers. Nishida working a bit earlier in the 20th century, Nishitani coming a bit after him, and then Ueda working up through the 21st century. What's sort of unique about these figures is that they were both drawing on an intimate familiarity with Zen Buddhism and the intellectual and religious traditions associated with it, and also Western philosophy and religious traditions. And they really sort of meld these different streams together in very interesting ways. I'd say generally within the works of the Kyoto School, you find a very existential orientation. Part of that's coming from the existential Western philosophy that Nishitani especially was engaging with. Also, though, Zen itself could be described as very existential in some of its standpoints. And another important aspect of these philosophers is they're really kind of grappling with modernity and modernism, especially in this period where Japan is sort of engaging with the global world a lot more, and dealing with certain unique issues of industrialization, technology, these sorts of things. And engaging with foreign cultures. We're dealing with an island nation here. So that gives it a sort of unique flavor. So they're picking up on some of these engagements with modernity that are happening in Western thought at the time, and making them relevant for Japanese people as well, and creating a very unique response to modernity by incorporating this Zen perspective. So within this philosophy, emptiness, nothingness, or if you want to use the Sanskrit term shunyata, this is sort of the key philosophical idea that these philosophers are all working with in different capacities. So Nishitani, Nishida, they're all sort of coming from a standpoint of emptiness. And what does that mean? So emptiness is a difficult concept to probe, but it's something very different than what we're perhaps used to with Western thought of thinking of things in terms of being. So it's sort of the opposite kind of approach, and that makes for some very exciting syntheses then with the Western thought that they're bringing together. One thing that perhaps ought to be mentioned in the context of a discussion on ecological civilization, a cause certainly that relates to these ideals of justice, is that in their own day, these Kyoto School thinkers had some perhaps problematic political associations with sort of the imperial fascistic Japanese state of sort of World War II era. There's been some interesting scholarship that has looked at that in more depth. The association is not nearly as strong as, say, Heidegger's association with the Nazi Party, but it's something to keep in mind, I think, when you're looking at philosophers such as these. So since this is Process and Faith, I thought it would be good to quickly note some similarities between the process perspective and the Kyoto School generally. So I think one of the big ones would be this emphasis on interconnection, that we're not looking at the world as an array of discrete entities that are autonomous and independent, but rather quite the opposite. We are dealing with a world that is fundamentally interconnected down to the very bones. And I'd say the Kyoto School philosophers and Whitehead particularly take this a little differently. Certainly Whitehead's scheme with concrescences and such is very, very nuanced, very complex, very precise. The Kyoto School philosophers, you get a more poetic sense coming from some of these Zen traditions, these koan type aphorisms that really give a different sense of what this interconnection means. It's more existential in flavor, certainly. Not to say that it's not ontological or metaphysical as well. It certainly is. This is also certainly a religious philosophy. So where Whitehead deals very explicitly with God, you see that sometimes in the writings of the Kyoto School, which is perhaps surprising for Buddhist philosophers who are coming from a tradition which is sort of notoriously considered as non-theistic. But it goes to show the depth of engagement with some of the Western religious sources that they are dealing with. Problems of sin and evil factor in really strongly in Nishitani's thinking. So do karma and codependent origination. So it's an interesting mix that you get. And certainly both these perspectives are positing an alternative to modernity and the conventional philosophies we've inherited. So Process goes about it again in a slightly different way, perhaps a little bit more of a ontologically focused way. The Kyoto School has a bit more of an existential flavor, but they certainly are coinciding on a number of points, even in the ontology. And I think also of note is the deep reading of the history of philosophy by both process thinkers and the Kyoto School philosophers. So I'll get to this in the next slide, but both of them have a tendency to locate sort of big philosophical problems throughout the history of philosophy. They really align in rejecting substance metaphysics of Aristotle and previous philosophers, and railing against some Cartesian perspectives. But they're also able to find a lot of truth and insight throughout the history of philosophy, from the beginning to very contemporary periods. And then also cosmopolitan ethos. Certainly with the Kyoto School, they're integrating both Western and Buddhist sources and some particularly Japanese perspectives as well. So that's where their fusion is primarily happening. But certainly the process movement today is extremely interreligious, and you have theologians working from all sorts of different traditions. But even in Whitehead, he is certainly eager to engage other religions to a degree as well. So let's get into this idea of emptiness and nothingness a bit to set the scene here. So as I mentioned, this is an alternative to the sort of traditional substance metaphysics that is kind of the foundation of a lot of Western thought. And this is basically the idea that a thing is what it is because it has a certain unique essence to it, some unimpeachable isness of its stuff, and process and the Kyoto School are both going to push back on that idea. The Kyoto School is going to say, no, there's actually nothing there. But that doesn't mean that there is nothing at all. There's just not this sort of one independent substance that makes a thing a thing. A thing comes to be and perishes in a very, very Buddhist sort of way. It is sort of in this flow of samsaric existence, and there ultimately is no svabhava in the Sanskrit, or sort of independent existence to it. It is part and parcel of this reality. And what allows this flow and this flux and this impermanence to happen is this nothingness, which for these Kyoto School thinkers is sort of the ground of being, the whence from which being and beings can arise. So from this perspective, instead of viewing nothingness or emptiness as this purely negative sort of phenomenon of there not being something there, oh no, things are impermanent and perishing. Well, this is actually what allows things to come into existence, and what allows them to change, and what allows them to enter into new relations. So it's actually got both this positive and negative valence to it within Buddhist thinking broadly, but certainly within the Kyoto School especially. And when looking at sort of Western concepts of nothingness, the Kyoto School thinkers see something to be desired. These philosophers, they think, such as Heidegger or Nietzsche, other such existentialists, they don't quite go far enough, according to the Kyoto School thinkers. You see in these philosophies a nothingness which is represented. So it's not a pure nothingness, which for Nishitani is going to be sort of immediately existential. It's not going to be just in your head. You're not just thinking nothingness. You're not just representing it mentally as there not being something there, but it's something you encounter in immediate experience through things like loss and death and grief, but also through joy and again these positive sides of life. And so, well, this is all very abstract metaphysical discussion here. I think it's helpful to provide an image here. That image would be Indra's net. So if you can picture sort of dew on a spider web, and in each drop of dew, as water does, it reflects. And so you can look at these drops of dew, and in each drop of dew, you can see the rest of the web and the other drops of dew reflected within it. But within each individual drop, there's nothing there. It's transparent liquid. There's no independent image that is being presented. It's reflection all the way down. So I think that's a great representation of this idea of nothingness that these philosophers are dealing with. So since we're going to be talking about ecological civilization, I thought that next up it would make sense to briefly touch on the topic and what's meant by ecological civilization. So this is right from the Cobb Institute website, pulled from another PowerPoint. We have a great set of educators' resources on the website. And so if you'd like to dive in a bit more in detail into ecological civilization, that's where you can find some slides that cover a bit more in depth. So in an ecological civilization, people live with respect and care for the community of life. They enjoy rich and loving bonds with one another, culturally, economically, and politically. And they know that they are part of the larger Earth community. The Earth community is the web of life itself, plants and animals, landscapes and waterways. It is a network of interbecoming, a community of communities of communities. So you see both the emphasis on the natural world and all the myriad beings within it for whom there is value, and they are themselves all valuable from the process perspective. But also you see the emphasis on the human side of things, on human community, human responsibility, the structures we create in the world. So in ecological civilization, we're really trying to bring this all together, bring together this community of life, this earth community, and its natural ebbs and flows, and our own human projects and communities and civilizations even. So all right, let's dive into it. So we will start with Nishida here, the founder of the Kyoto School, and I think the place to go in Nishida for these kinds of environmental ethics, if you want to call them that, is his notion of basho. So in Japanese, basho is translated as place. And this is a very important concept in Nishida's thinking. It's sort of at the core of his ontology, his epistemology even. It's really kind of a centerpiece of how he thinks about mind, but also about the world, the cosmos, etc. So it's kind of interesting about this idea, this notion, is it kind of has, it points to how Nishida's method is somewhat opposite to what Hegel's doing. So where Hegel is interested in, you have a thesis and antithesis, and then what can you get when you bring them together and synthesize them? So sort of this progressive movement. Nishida's doing the opposite. He sees a thesis and an antithesis, and he asks, what is the ground on which these are both sort of become meaningful? And so it's sort of a progression backwards in that sense. And so because of this, you get a philosophy that is really interested in sort of stepping behind different dualisms that we create. And perhaps most important of these is subject-object dualism. So Nishida will say that there is a basho, a place from which subject and object emerge as this dualism. And this place itself cannot be objectified in an important way. And so in that sense, it has this aspect of emptiness to it as well. But even though it can't be objectified, it can't be brought into these sort of conceptual frameworks, doesn't mean that it's this wholly passive, unimportant sort of element in life. In fact, the basho is very active. It has a creative element to it. So it's not just this sort of inert matter of the mechanistic worldview, but it's sort of the bubbling of life itself in the cosmos. So out of the basho, creation occurs. In Nishida's philosophy, also, we have an intimate link between interdependence and autonomy, which is interesting. So it is out of the basho and this place that brings relations together that our agency arises. So whereas we're used to thinking about the external world as perhaps placing constraints on us, Nishida pushes back and says, no, that this is exactly the situation that provides our freedom as agents. Also crucially is self-negation. So in this sort of process of creativity, in this interdependence we find ourselves in, our autonomy is going to come to the fore through our self-negation. And this certainly has resonances with basic Buddhist concepts such as no self, so the emptiness of the self. And yeah, so that on the human side, that's certainly something that is essential here. So what can we do with this idea for ecological purposes? Well, here's some points. One is that there's ways to relate to the natural world outside of this subject-object duality. So we're not just thinking about the natural world as stuff out there, as external, as things we can represent, can relate to, can use even. But we sort of settle back into this perspective of BASHO, that there's this place that we are all sharing in a certain way. And then also we can work with this unobjectifiable creativity that exists in BASHO. So it doesn't all need to be human beings doing human work to make things happen. In fact, this BASHO, this place, it's already having all sorts of creative energy pulsing through it. So getting more in tune with some of those natural rhythms there could be more powerful than trying to come in and sort of impose a framework. Can also get some deeper gratitude for the places we find ourselves in and how they open up new possibilities and create our identity. So with this idea of interconnectedness and agency or autonomy being very linked, we see how the natural world is not something we need to fight against or bring under our will, but very much a place of grace and beauty that creates our identity and allows us to explore and experience novelty in this world. And also, we might realize that we need to remake ourselves, our communities, and our societies to work harmoniously with this intrinsic creativity. So this idea of self-negation, it's not necessarily going to be just this this easy process. There might be some ways in which we need to step back or reevaluate our identities, our practices, to allow this this creation to flow in a way that that works more harmoniously. So here's a quote from one of our resources about Nishida's perspective here. In the face of ecological crises, the recognition that we are emplaced in a contingent world, the horizon of which is indeterminately bounded by the other to human constructs, may help counter humanity's plundering of nature through the reduction or dissipation of man's presumption of privilege vis-a-vis that other. In the face of our world's embeddedness within an ecological network that does not preclude the unpredictable, the wildness of the wilderness, we have no real choice but to share responsibility in caring for the environment. All right, onward to Nishitani here. So Nishitani is Nishida's student, as mentioned, and here especially you see a very existential turn in thinking, as Nishitani studied very directly the European existentialist. He studied with Heidegger, in fact. So you see some very Heideggerian influences in his thinking that were not nearly as prominent in his teachers. And one of the ways that influence comes up is sort of his critique of science and technology here. So yeah, one of the issues for Nishitani is that the power of science's method has led us to view the world in mechanistic terms. So science tends to, the science that Nishitani's discussing and critiquing here anyways, have this methodological use of this mechanistic perspective. So science looks at things as if they are these kinds of determinate systems that operate by very, very constant laws and work like a machine, basically. You put A in, you get B out. And so certainly for scientific progress, this method has worked wonders. But Nishitani's critique is that, well, just because this method works scientifically for obtaining objective knowledge of the external physical world doesn't mean that it is sort of the only valid metaphysical perspective. But that's kind of what we've sort of walked into, sort of unconsciously, perhaps. We've kind of absorbed this scientific materialism as the sort of only valid metaphysics. And Nishitani's issue with this, among other things, is leads to nihilism. If things are just material and deterministic, if there's no sort of purpose, we fall into, well, why does it matter? Why does it matter? And certainly, if we're viewing nature through this lens, does ecological collapse matter? Certainly, you can argue, perhaps from a human point of view, it's like pragmatically bad. But if you get deep enough into this materialistic perspective, what does the human life even matter? So the problem is very deep for Nishitani here. Also, a very interesting argument he makes is about this idea of the scientific appropriation of natural laws. So through science, discovering natural laws and then creating technology that uses these laws in various ways, such as an engine, which takes use of certain laws of energy, combustion and such. This pursuit has increased human freedom, and I think that's pretty self-evident. And you can get different places in the world much quicker nowadays than was ever possible in the past. Medical technology has extended human life in so many different ways. And communications technology has allowed people to talk to one another through extreme distances. But the interesting part of his argument is that as our freedom has increased through appropriating, through taking advantage of these natural laws we discover, we actually are, in a sense, losing freedom as well. We are becoming more and more sort of subservient to these laws, and they come into sharper relief. So whereas these laws were sort of naturally embedded and interrelated in the pre-modern world, in modern world, you see them sort of pulled out of context. And when you get that, you get things like, well, certainly nowadays a huge problem is sort of the addiction to cell phones and these types of technologies. But yeah, it gives you a very different perspective on the world. If you feel that you are an agent that can sort of appropriate natural laws at will to sort of exert your desires on a world that is external and mechanistic, why not? Why not? Yeah, I just think of even little things here, like the need to always be listening to music or a podcast. We're always imposing our will on our experience, even. And because of that, there's less and less room for things to sort of arise spontaneously externally from us and remind us that the external world is autonomous, and also that it is not just this sort of amorphous blob of stuff, but actually a bustling community of other subjects, of other beings, of myriad creatures. So. And a final problem here is that science, in this methodological superiority in finding sort of this objective material truth, has come to be seen as the sole version of truth in modernity. But the issue is that it's only an objectivized truth. It is only a truth of things as they are represented through scientific and philosophical paradigms as sort of external stuff. And That's great if you want to tow a field as efficiently as possible, or invent a new antibiotic, but it leaves less and less room for subjective truth, for ethics, for existential aspects of life. So we don't want a science that does not allow for other modes of knowing. So Nishitani proposes multiple absolutes that yes, science and its objective truth, that's absolute. He's certainly not denying the validity or power of science, but he would push back and say that there's also mythological truth. There's a sort of religious existential truth, and that these can be just as much absolute and very, very important in life if we make space for them. So what can we get from Nishitani here for ecological civilization? Well, I think we can get this notion that we got to invest in ethical and spiritual development as much as technological development to address ecological problems. So you hear a lot nowadays these sort of Hail Mary technological fixes to our climate crisis, but unless we are able to really reform ourselves as a human community and start acting differently, the problem is just sort of kicked down the line more and more, and we've certainly already been doing that a long time. So being able to deal with these other forms of truth is going to be imperative to allowing for a more substantial development that actually gets us to see things differently and behave differently in fundamental ways. We also need to be critiquing the applications of science and the role of technology. And that's going to be essential for building this ecological civilization, because just because you can invent this new hyper effective pesticide doesn't mean that that would actually be a good thing to introduce into the world, ecologically speaking. It could have all sorts of consequences. Plastics, was it a good idea to invent plastics? They have certainly allowed us to do so many things. They've increased human freedom in all these ways, but it's led to all these catastrophic externalities. So having more of that foresight, having that critique, is going to be essential. And I think perhaps most interestingly is that our personal struggles with nihilism are intimately linked with some of these ecological issues through this mechanistic paradigm we've fallen into. So not only is pulling out of that paradigm and finding other perspectives going to be very important ecologically, but we also have a lot to gain in terms of pulling away from nihilism. So whereas often these kinds of ecological discussions, it seems like you're talking about trade-offs with human well-being and sort of ecological justice. Oh, these are all the things we might need to give up for a more sustainable planet. But if we can avoid some of the nihilism of our modern world, that's certainly going to be a net positive for well-being. So I think Nishitani presents a picture for a win-win here, certainly. So here's a brief quotation from the man himself, and this is taken from Religion and Nothingness. Once natural science and its image of the world had been established, the teleological conception of the natural world gave way to a mechanistic one, bringing a fundamental change in the relation between man and nature. As this intellectual process continued, the natural world assumed more and more the feature of a world cold and dead, governed by laws of mechanical necessity, completely indifferent to the fact of man. While it continues to be the world in which we live and is inseparably bound up in our existence, it is a world in which we find ourselves unable to live as man, in which our human mode of being is edged out of the picture or even obliterated. All right, and now the final philosopher I'm going to discuss today is Watsuji Tetsuro. And he, in fact, is not exactly a member proper of the Kyoto School, but he's certainly an important 20th century Japanese thinker. He's dealing with many of the same core issues and has a similar emphasis on emptiness. And he worked with Nishida as well. But he's a very important Japanese philosopher, but a bit more of a peripheral figure in terms of this specific lineage of the Kyoto School. So Watsuji has this interesting concept of fudo, or historical milieu is how it's often translated. So this is the specific historical, material, natural context in which human beings, human societies find themselves. So this is kind of his building block idea, out of which then his sort of ethical and social theorizing comes out of. The other important building block here is that he's going to view the human self as empty. So instead of this perspective of a human being as sort of this autonomous agent with an independent identity, likewise with this sort of critique of the substance metaphysics, he's kind of applying that to the human being specifically, and in a very Buddhist way. He's saying there's no self. Instead, you have human beings that are fundamentally relational and interdependent. So there's nothing in there, but certainly pragmatic identities and such still exist. But really what's important for him is the interdependence, and not only one person to one person, but on all sorts of levels, interdependence socially, in the family, in the community, in the state, sort of all the way up and down. He sees interdependence and empty selves as the baseline. And so as a result, you have a very relational standpoint in terms of ethics. One of his interesting insights is that ethics emerges as a consequence of our interrelatedness with others. So against someone like Kant or someone like Thomas Aquinas, who have these kind of big ethical systems that are presenting natural laws or sort of basic moral principles, Watsuji works from the ground up instead. So there aren't big principles or natural laws to follow, but practical problems to solve that arise out of our context in community, our context in relations with others. And one point about Fudo, about these historical milieu, is that they have their own characteristics unique to themselves. So you get almost like a sense of a kind of sort of determinism, kind of naturalistic determinism in Watsuji, that there's sort of like a Japanese spirit that came out of the particular like mountainous island milieu of Japan. But I think there's some more some more proper readings of him that don't quite go that far in this perspective. But certainly, importantly here, local places are different. You know, what happens in sub-Saharan Africa and what happens in the Arctic, very different. And the kinds of human relations that arise out of these natural contexts are also very different as a result. And yeah, so our cultures arise out of these unique fudo. And so this also means that sort of cultural products, art, these sorts of things, building materials, they make use of what's immediately available. It doesn't arise out of nowhere. You're interrelated with this natural environment. And then finally, like with Nishida, this idea of self-negation is very important for Watsuji, but here in a specifically kind of ethical context. So when interacting with others, when engaging with others, we sort of become subservient to them, and they become subservient to us in a sense. There's this kind of reciprocity in this interrelation, and having that option of being sort of overtaken by the otherness of the other, and then kind of responding creatively out of that place. That's really kind of necessary for ethical action for Watsuji. You can't just kind of steamroll. That would be totally against what he's seeing here as an important ethical vision. So what can we get from Watsuji here? One important idea is that different local contexts have different ecological needs, and they also have different cultural resources for responding to ecological crisis. So often we talk about environmental issues as such a global problem, which certainly it is. But what the particular environmental problems of a particular place are, it's going to differ place to place. So being able to think more locally, I think, is one of the helpful points of Watsuji's picture here. And then also, as a result of this localism, it's not only that the problems are different, but the resources are different. And that can mean literal physical resources. Perhaps there's a particular natural resource in a location that could have some good sustainable use, or perhaps there's a particular historical institution in a place that might have an important role to play in combating local environmental issues, or there's certain dispositions of people in different places that you need to work with in responding to ecological crisis. Another insight is that some of the most powerful ecological actions are responding to the practical problems of local communities and as a local community. So again, here we're dealing with the interrelatedness, and you're certainly most interrelated with your sort of immediate surroundings and the people in your immediate surroundings. So being able to work off of that basis is going to provide something more substantive than trying to work fully globally and respond to problems that are abstract in a sense. Oh, the temperature is rising. Certainly it is. And that's a huge issue to deal with. But your own community probably has very specific issues. Composting is a great example. Food production, relatedly. How can those be done sustainably within your community? How can you respond to issues of housing in a way that also is conscious of ecological impact in your own community? And finally, another insight is that we're already connected to this natural environment through Fudo. So we have an ethical obligation towards it as another entity in this interrelated framework. And I think it helps us, his perspective here helps us acknowledge that on a deeper level. The Fudo is where our culture has arisen from, where our material products that we care about have sort of come from. And that's certainly something we should care about, and we should develop this care. And that care can then form as the basis for these ethics for the environment. And yes, certainly we might need to self-negate some. We might need to really revise our projects, our identities. So a final quote here from one of our other resources from author Lena Droz. Watsuji's conception of the self is embodied, relational, ever-changing, and always situated in a historical milieu. This milieu is the particular natural environment covered by meanings and symbols lived out within the historical movements of the culture. Human existence is intrinsically relational. The realization of the self through constant dynamic cycles of co-determination with the historical milieu is made possible by the betweenness or the emptiness between the self and the other. Finally, environmental ethical decision-making emerges from these constant cycles of making sense of the world and acting on it. So that's my presentation for this evening. Thank you very much for coming along and listening to me. And